All right, let's get started, everyone. So, hello, welcome to the Princeton Review's MCAT strategy session. My name is Scott, and I will be co-hosting our presentation tonight along with our resident expert, the other Scott. So there's two of us. You get two for the price of one tonight. Before we kick off our webinar, let's cover just a few housekeeping items. Just so you know, everyone's lines are muted. So if you do have questions or anything you'd like to share with us, or there's something that you want to share with us, please use the question box located in your GoToWebinar menu bar. Also, we will do our very best to get through everyone's questions tonight, but if we are unable to do so or due to time constraints, one of our experts will follow up with you after the webinar. And then finally, tonight's session is being recorded, so there's really no need for you to take notes. Each of you will be receiving a copy of the recording after the webinar is over. So just sit back and enjoy the presentation. So without any further ado, Scott, I want to pass it over to you and take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Scott. As said, my name is also Scott. I've been with the Princeton Review since 2011 after I studied physics and environmental science at UCLA. Kind of fell in love with teaching when I got here, and I'm one of our test prep weirdos who teaches everything from elementary school children for like the ISEE and SSAT, all the way up through SAT, ACT, GRE, GMAT, MCAT, and I teach the physics and cars sections, or I guess physics content and cars techniques for our courses. We do break our instructors into their specific fields, unlike some of our competitors. So if you were coming here specifically with some bio questions in mind, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be your best resource there. My bio is pretty bad, but my physics and my reasoning skills are at least on point well enough for this test. Today we'll be looking at the MCAT, getting some good fundamental ideas of what it's about, what we need to do for success on it. We'll see a few sample passages and questions. We'll quickly go through primarily physics and cars, and then we'll look at a few of your options for help to make sure that you are doing what you can to position yourself for success in your application process. There's a note there, it'll come up again at the end of the presentation. We do currently have a discount if you're enrolling in our courses, so I did want to point that out in case you are on the edge there. All right, let's look at the MCAT. The MCAT, or the Medical College Admission Test, is required by pretty much every US and Canadian med school, even a few others. It's developed by this group called AAMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges. They actually are a really big deal when it comes to med school admissions, because not only do they make the MCAT, they actually basically own the admissions process for about all the schools besides the Texas schools. They have their own sort of admissions thing, but they also help set the sort of agenda when it comes to med school, and honestly even some of the content and requirements when it comes to what med schools actually have to offer all their students. So they're a big deal, and they do take ownership of the MCAT itself, so they administer it. It's one of the biggest things they do, and to be honest, it's kind of a big money maker for them because it is such a competitive field. So there's some good and some bad to that group, but we want to be prepared for at least the MCAT portion at this point. All right, the MCAT itself. One of the first questions we get, a lot of people want to know, or a lot of students want to know, when they should actually take the test. Varying schools of thought on this, but honestly, it boils down to when you're ready. Once you've taken all of the prereqs, which is basically you've got your year of biology, a year of physics, like introductory physics, general chemistry and organic chemistry, basically you need a year of each of those, as well as a semester of biochemistry, psychology, and sociology. So this test actually covers a pretty wide number of disciplines. So we want to make sure that we've got that content down, but that's really it. The MCAT is all about application of fundamental principles from each of those disciplines. So you don't need advanced knowledge in any of those fields to be successful on this test. And oftentimes that actually tends to hurt students where they start to overthink things. So once you've got that down and then you've got enough practice, you feel comfortable that you know the test, then you should go take it. If that's after basically your freshman year of college, maybe that summer you put in the work and you're ready to go, then go for it then. Kind of knock it out, get it out early. Many students take it after their third or fourth year of college, so great option there. But to be honest, the average admission age for medical students is about 27, which means many people are post-college doing, advanced degrees, taking some years off, maybe going to work or whatever various things might be happening in their life, and then they come back and kind of take the MCAT then, which has its own struggles. You might have improved your reasoning skills, but lost some of that content. So it is, once you're ready, it's really the best time to take it. As far as what time of year you should take it, their testing year starts in January, and the test is offered kind of in random, like it's January, they have a date at the end of March, then kind of from April, May, June, July, August, and early September, they have a lot of test dates. Actually, this next year, they're going to have even more test dates than they've previously had. So you'll have lots of options, but after that mid-September, early to mid-September test date, you can't take the test until the following January. So you do want to kind of plan when you're going to prep for the test, because you don't want to test or prep all like late summer, early fall, and then have to wait until January until you actually can take the exam. The other big frustrating thing about the test is you can only hold one reservation at a time. Big news actually just released by AMC is that on the 18th, all of the test dates from January through May of next year will be available for registration, so you guys can actually pick those dates. But you will want to kind of snag that test date and then line up your preparation for it. But there is no best month to test in necessarily. There's not like scores are higher in March or something like that, or it's easier in April, nothing like that. So once you're ready, once you can dedicate as much time and effort as you need to get your score where it should be, go ahead and take that test. A few other things to consider, although you can only take or make one reservation at a time, you can take the test up to 3 times in a year. Or if you're kind of spreading it out over 2 years, you have 4 times over 2 years. And you do have a lifetime limit of 7 times. So you don't want to just think, oh, I'll keep doing it until I eventually get the score I want. Really the best way to do this, or the best approach to take, is to one and done it, right? Prepare for it, take it seriously, get the score you wanted, or maybe even higher, depending on how much effort you put into it, and then never have to think of it again. It almost raises flags for schools if you do end up taking the test, 5, 6, even 7 times, because their concern is, how will you do on the USMLE? Right? The medical licensing examination at the end of medical school is a huge deal. It's going to help with, honestly, your placement in residency. It'll be a big determining factor in that, which reflects a lot on that medical school. So even if you have great grades, a great application, if it took you a lot of attempts to get a mediocre MCAT score, that might just absolutely sink your chances of medical school. So take it seriously the first time. Don't take it, bomb it, and then try to get back on track. Like, if you can take it seriously the first time, it is going to be one of the first big hurdles to get over in this process. So as far as your test dates, like I said, there are more test dates next year than there are this year. So actually, looks like my slide got a little off, because those are the 2018 test dates minus one in August. That seems to be missing. But the registration, as I said, opens up next, Wednesday. And think that's at 8 a.m. So if you are looking to test in the first part of next year, you will want to snag up one of those test dates. A big difference this year actually is that you can go in starting today actually is you can put in your information to create an account. You have to have an account and basically your ID number to register for the test. If you've ever created an account at or with AAMC before, you must use the same account. So if you bought some prep materials for them or maybe some sample tests from them, you cannot create a duplicate account. It could actually prevent you from getting into medical school. So if you've already done something with them, make sure you do use that same account. They're crazy sticklers for the rules, but this is a pretty high stakes game, so you can't blame them. The test dates after that, basically the last half of their testing year, will open up typically in February. Usually right about Valentine's Day is when you see those test dates open up. So, if you aren't looking to test until maybe next summer, you still have to be sort of ahead of the game in that you want to register, get that test date at that specific location you're looking to test at, because many test dates or locations and dates will fill up within an hour or two when that registration goes live. If you're in a state like I'm in California, we have tons of applicants here for medical school and tons of pre-meds here. So a lot of the testing facilities fill up just in a matter of hours of that registration. So if you don't want to have to add travel to one of your considerations when you're taking your MCAT, do snag one of those test dates as soon as you possibly can. They do have a weird pricing structure they introduced last year on the MCAT. Basically, the sooner you register, the more options you have and the lower the price is. So if you're over a month out from your test date, you're in the gold zone. Not only is it a cheap fee to reschedule, or you get some money back if you need to cancel, you get to pay $50 less than if you wait until the last minute. Silver zone, about 3 to 4 weeks before the exam. It's like 15 to 29 days. Once you're in that zone, or once you cross into that zone, if you were already registered, you cannot cancel, or at least you can cancel, but you won't get a refund. And it's kind of expensive to change your date, but that's usually when the pressure gets on and people start making changes to their plans. And once you get within 8 days, you are in the bronze zone, then you cannot even reschedule your test if you wanted to. So you either get to no-show, which does count as one of your 7 lifetime tests, or you can take the test and have it voided. Basically, they won't score it, but you'll get the experience of it. And that also counts as one of your 7 lifetime tests. So when it gets to basically that last week before the test, you're locked in, and if you didn't make any changes or any necessary adjustments, then you're in kind of a tough spot. But again, that's where the pressure tends to be at its max, and since they experienced so many people basically canceling the day before their test, they introduced this new zone, or I guess date range thing. All right, the test itself has a very fixed structure. It has 4 sections that are equally weighed as far as counting towards your total score. The sections got really long names when they redid the test back in 2015. So the first section, the Chem Phys section, as it is generally called, is the section that contains most of the physical sciences as well as the most organic chemistry you'll come across. It's primarily chemistry, about 30% chemistry, and 25% biochemistry. So that's more than half right there is sort of physical, or your general chemistry there. Then you have 15% organic chemistry. It's only 25% physics. So those of you that are not physicists, which I imagine is most of you, don't worry, it's a quarter of the test. So a 16th of your test is physics. You can actually do or get a very competitive score and do none of the physics on the test if you want. Or with a little bit of effort, you can learn some of the big physics topics and kind of ignore the rest of them. So that section, 59 questions, 95 minutes. the first section will come across, and you get a score from 118 to 132. The average score in that section and all the sections is a 125. So for many students, this is a little daunting that they start with the subjects that tend to be one of the biggest struggles for, or at least science struggles for students with physics and chemistry. After that, you'll have what we call the CARS section. That's critical analysis and reasoning skills. Used to be the verbal section on the old MCAT, for those of you that have tracked it for a while. Seems like that question or that section's a little bit shorter in that it's only 53 questions and 90 minutes. But as far as pacing goes, that's actually the toughest section because that section requires a lot of reading. So although you have about the same amount of time, honestly a little bit more time per question than the other sections, it doesn't feel like it. That section actually has about a 124 for the average, since it is typically the worst subject for all students. After that, you have your biochem section. Much like Chem Phys, it is 59 questions, 95 minutes. It tends to be the area that most pre-meds are most confident in because many of you are biology majors. So they've waited until you're a little bit tired, right? You've already done over 3 hours of testing before they let you get into something you're good at. And then they finish on what is generally called the psych-social section, which is, again, 59 questions in 95 minutes. And much like Chem Phys, those last two sections have a 125 for the average, or at least the average score. So they add these 4 subscores, and you get a total score that can be as low as a 472, as high as a 528. But they if you're on the average on all of them, you will get basically a 500. It is purely based on the number of correct answers. So those of you that are maybe used to some, the old SAT or some of those subject tests, you might be familiar with minus points for questions. There are no minus points on the MCAT, so put an answer down for every question. The ones you don't know, you always have a 25% chance of guessing. If you are average on every section, you'll end up at a 500. Or very close to a 500, if not that 499, which is overall the average. So they're trying, and they do a very good job of creating a bell curve with the scores on this test. Each question is a multiple choice question, so there are no long answers, no short answers, no essays. They are all multiple choice. They all have 4 answer choices. So like I said, 25% chance of simply guessing the right answer. And there are 2 formats for the questions. They have passage-based questions, which on the CARS section, they're all passage-based because it is, getting your reasoning skills or that verbal reasoning. So there's no content there. You have to find all the information in the text or in the passage they give you. You'll get that for most, basically, about 75% of the questions in each science section are passage-based, and then a quarter of the questions are freestanding. Sort of like quick question, 4 answers, can you answer it? No passage required. So, and as I said, no guessing penalties. So, although there are these 53 to 59 questions per section, the way you attack them will be a little bit different than maybe you're used to attacking questions in your class. The most recent percentile range, as you see, makes a pretty bell curve. This is a scaled test. So some of you might actually be familiar with a scaled test versus a curved test. For those of you that aren't, this is not a curved test. So you are not competing against the people you are testing with on that day or really even in that year. You're testing against the scale that is made up from the prior years of testing. Actually, they go back 3 years of tests when they can, and your score, your performance is basically compared to this preset scale. So there is no, you can't mess people up around you or do something to affect the scoring curve. but it does create a nice bell curve, or pretty close to a bell curve as you see here, with that average right there out of 500. Most people are aiming for that nice 509 or 510 score. As we see here looking at the percentiles, 509 is the 80th percentile, which makes it pretty comparable to the 30 on the old test. Those of you who might look up MCAT or med school data over the years, most students used to be going for that 30 to be competitive, and now its equivalent is basically the 509, or because it's a nice round number, a lot of people look at the 510, which is actually a little better than that 30. So you want to try your best to achieve that range or even higher. I do want to point out here, as you see there, that 523 is where you hit the 100th percentile, which means you're as good or better than 100% of testers. This information here that they've released indicates that no one has actually scored higher than a 523 on the new MCAT. So to put things in perspective, those of you who maybe even got a perfect SAT or ACT score in high school, back on the 2400 scale for your SAT, the last year they offered that, there were about 600 perfect scores. On the ACT that year, there were about 2,400 perfect scores. So lots of perfect scores on those tests. That doesn't happen on the MCAT. It's a whole new ball game here. So you do need to approach this test differently than you're used to, even those of you that are high achieving on previous standardized tests. The MCAT isn't messing around. So just keep in mind, if you're thinking, oh, well, 528 is perfect, maybe I'll aim for like a 522, 523, you're basically saying you are planning to be the best MCAT tester that they've seen so far on this exam. So, it is, or at least as good as the best MCAT tester they've seen so far. So keep in perspective, the point of any standardized test or any good standardized test and any good scoring scale is to have 0 perfect scores. Right? If you think about when you were in elementary school and they had spelling tests, if everyone in the class got a perfect, you don't actually know who the best speller was. Right? But if they made the test so hard that no one got a perfect, you generally still know who the best speller was, because it's whoever did the best on that test, which is probably only one person. So they're trying to do the same thing here. They set a very difficult scale so they can separate the good from the great, from the amazing, from the Einsteins, right? So you just want to keep in mind that aiming for, above a 515 is a pretty high goal. Even a 510 to be competitive is not an easy task. The actual structure when you sit down, or the timing when you sit down, is pretty straightforward. You sit down and you have an examinee agreement. That is, kind of like signing a lease. You have to do it. So you should have honestly read it before the test. You can do that on any of your sample tests that you should be taking. So you don't really want to mess around with that. And then you get the tutorial. As far as the first strategy sort of idea, don't skip the tutorial. It's optional. You could just be like, nope, I've got it, which in one sense you should. You should have done enough practice to know what the exam is going to look like and all the tools and everything available to you. But that's where you can take that 10 minutes to set yourself up for success. You can let the tutorial run and let the clock run out as maybe you set up your scratch paper. You write down all of your formulas. That first section is Chem Phys. Maybe you write down all of your physics formulas, right? And any chemistry details you might need. Maybe you take that 10 minutes to meditate and focus and find that sort of calm place so you can be very successful on this exam. Maybe you take it to just put your head down and rest some more because you're not used to getting up that early, which hopefully you've addressed prior to the test day. Whatever it is, use that 10 minutes and then get into, like I said, Chem Phys section, 95 minutes, and then you get an optional break. You should be taking any breaks you are offered during the test. Try to go to the bathroom, get some snacks. Honestly, when you're doing your practice tests, you should be doing them as well. So you are used to the sort of test day routine you'll have. So you should start your practice tests just before 9 a.m., about the same time you'll start the official test day. You have to be there at 8, but there's a whole check-in process. So your test will probably start a little closer to 9. So start your practice test that day, take your breaks. If you know what you're going to eat for your snacks, like eat those snacks to see how they affect your performance. If you're going to drink a Red Bull and smoke a cigarette during your break, then by all means, go ahead and do that. You can reevaluate your life choices later. Right now, we got to make sure you get through this test. And then, as you move along, you do have, you'll notice, an optional lunch break, so that 30-minute break. You can go get food, you can bring food, and leave it in your locker. Just a heads up, you cannot bring anything into the testing area with you that isn't provided by the test center. So they will give you earplugs. They will give you your scratch board and your marker that you can use. And those of you that are maybe familiar with the MCAT, I did say that correctly. This year they announced a change that they will be doing boards and markers instead of paper and pencil. So something you might want to get used to as far as taking your practice tests. You might go out and get a little booklet of boards. It's like a 4-board booklet, and get a marker and get used to not using scratch paper like you have potentially been told. That was an announcement made yesterday in their document for next testing year. So you're hearing it here first. So you can't bring anything but those items in. If you have a sweatshirt or something and you get warm and you take it off, you will generally be instructed to go put it in your locker, which means you have to leave the testing area. To get back into the testing area, you have to give them a scan of your palm veins. They'll wave a metal detecting wand over you, and the clock doesn't stop while they do all this. So this is where you want to get used to. Any changes you make are done during the break. You can go to the bathroom during the test, but likewise, the clock doesn't stop and you have to go through that whole process to re-enter the testing area. So you want your test day routine to be pretty set, another normal walk through the park when you get to the actual test day. At the end of the exam, you see there's this void question where they've given you 5 minutes. Actually, I think it might be 3 minutes now. Didn't look at that, but it's 3 to 5 minutes where they give you this opportunity to consider, do you want your test scored or not? Again, if you void your exam, it counts as one of your lifetime attempts or one of your maximum 3 in a year. And there aren't many good reasons for you to actually void your exam. Right? If you were like violently ill, like ill to the point where it's drastically affecting your test, yeah, sure, void your exam. Or if you have sort of a test abnormality that AAMC doesn't consider an abnormality, maybe the power went out during your test or the internet went down for an hour and a half, so you just had to kind of wait and then it was restored and you have to continue your exam. AAMC doesn't actually consider that an abnormality, but now your test day just took an hour and a half longer than most other people's, so yeah, good reason for you to possibly void your exam if you weren't feeling so great about it. But generally, you're not going to feel great about your test after the exam. Think about going back to those grade school spelling tests. Right? Think of those days where you got really good scores, or most of you probably did fairly well. But after the exam, you maybe remembered the one question you got wrong, right? Or one or two things, and that's all you focused on. You're not worried about the 18 you got right or the 19 you got right. You're thinking about the 1 or 2 you got wrong. And we all tend to do that. So you'll never feel great about your test. So you really do need to have a good reason to void your exam. And we see here, you get just over 6 hours of actual test, but it takes about 7.5 hours for you to get through. So plan that for each of your practice tests. That's basically an entire work day. So if you're doing it on Saturday, that's most of your Saturday gone. If you're not doing it on that or on a Saturday, if you're doing it on a weekday, you might have to take the day off work. You might have to skip your classes that day. It is going to be the majority of your day. All right, your key to success: know the test. You need to know the format of the test. You need to know the pacing of the test. You need to know the structure and the tools of the test. These are the keys to success. And kind of pairing with that, know yourself. Know what you're good at and where you're going to find your easy points on the test. Getting a look at the test here, we see this is how your passages will generally look. Passage on the left side, question on the right. You get one question at a time. Generally, you can see the entire question, but some of the longer questions will actually spill off the page and you'll have to scroll down. The passages, you almost always have to scroll down to see the entire thing. So we see here, you can tell this passage is cut off, so you know that you do need to scroll down, and we get the rest of it. The big thing to look for at the bottom of your passage is what we call the blurb. It'll give you some information about maybe the author or the paper that this came from. A lot of these come from scientific journals, and you might find out, like looking just here at this blurb, we see that we're looking at the treatment of adults with glycogen storage disease type 1. Kind of tell this is a biology passage, and if that's something I'm familiar with, I might prioritize it. And if this is Greek to me, right, if you've never seen this or you just know that this is absolutely something you suck at, then next strategy, save this for last, if at all. All right, you need to prioritize questions you can get right, rather than don't just take the test in the order it's given to you. You might find some easy questions at the end, but you're out of time and you don't have an opportunity to truly get them right. And now you're missing easy points when you focused on hard points that you're probably going to get wrong anyways, at least some of them. Up here on the top right, there's a periodic table button. As you'd expect, it pops up a periodic table, but it's a pretty basic periodic table. So when you're doing any of your practice, do not have a fancy periodic table with you. You want to make sure that you don't give yourself resources that you won't have during the test. Other tools you'll have a highlight tool. So if you were to click and drag your mouse on a certain part of the passage and then let go, you'll see, as you see on the screen here, there's a little button that pops up at the end of whatever you covered, and that is your highlight. When you click it, it'll turn whatever you had selected into a highlight. Those highlights will stay put, so you can leave the passage and come back, or as you go through various questions on this passage, they don't go away. They will stay there the entire time. One of the cool things you have available to you as well is that you can highlight in the passage. In the question stem as in addition to the passage, which actually makes it easy to kind of find important points that the question is making or that you need to watch out for. Additionally, you have the ability to strike through answers. If you right-click on an answer choice, as you see here, A and C were right-clicked on, and they've visually struck out the answer. That doesn't actually change your ability to select it. It's just purely a visual cue for you. So you can actually still, like I could click on A, like left click on A and still select it as my answer. So if you do that, that's on you. There's no like way to go back and say, look, I selected a strike through. Obviously, I meant to choose a different answer. Doesn't work that way. So you've got to be careful. Although the strike through is helpful in there, we still have to be cautious about what we're selecting. The score report that you'll get at the end will give you your sub score, and they give you these confidence bands, basically saying your actual score may be plus or minus 1 point. At any test that you're going to take, there's a degree of error. So they're saying that you should be plus or minus 1 point of whatever score you got. And they'll give you the percentiles within that section. There is actually an additional part, basically a score profile giving strengths and weaknesses across all 4 sections of the exam, which is useful if you're trying to test again. But for the most part, schools will primarily care about that overall score. So that, 509 if you're aiming for that, if you get it. Strength or weakness in certain sections generally isn't a big deal, with the exception of cars. There's a little bit of a focus on cars. A good cars score, even if the rest of your score is a little weak. If you got, say, a 506, but you were basically perfect in cars, that will actually resonate with the admissions committee. But like I said, cars tends to be the biggest struggle for most students or most testers. So a good score with a slightly weak cars score isn't usually a big red flag for most admissions committees. So knowing really what it takes to get into med school, know what you're up against. You want to see that the numbers will always rise, at least within your lifetime. Med school applicants, or the med school applicant pool is growing, is consistently growing and is projected to keep growing faster than the number of seats in med schools for years. Those of you in Texas have a little bit of an advantage because Texas is just building med schools like crazy. If you're not in Texas, that doesn't help you too much. But we see here, the average applicant here is applying with a 501. Honestly, not much better than the average tester, which is about a 500. Right? But the average matriculant, people getting into medical school, are coming in with about a 508. Right? We see that 508.7. So you really should be aiming for that, 508, 509. But the big thing to notice here, the average GPA, right? Although the average GPA has been rising over the years from a 3.64 up to a 3.7 for those that are getting in, it's still, and you take this with a grain of salt, but it's still only a 3.7. And by that I mean it's not, a B in freshman year chemistry that kept you out of medical school. Statistically speaking here, most med school matriculants have gotten some B's and even some C's, or possibly even a C or two, and still made it into medical school. It's not saying that this will be true for all med schools, but for med school in general, you can, have a mistake here or there in sort of your academic past when it comes to your grades. So just be aware that you don't think that it's just one little thing in your application that kept you out. They are going to consider your entire application. So as we see here, not just one component. Now your GPA and your MCAT scores are particularly important in that a lot of schools will just cut out the applicants that are below whatever they have arbitrarily kind of set as their cutoff. Because a student who has a weak GPA, if you're coming in with a 3.0 and a 494 MCAT score, it's not worth their time to really read your application. You have not demonstrated that you'll be able to handle the rigors of medical school. If you have a strong GPA and a weak test score, or the other way around, you might still be able to get over that hurdle, but it's usually kind of a sliding scale between the two. So if a weakness in one can be overcome by strength in another, but to be honest, a weak MCAT score, even with a strong GPA, is a rough thing to overcome because, again, the med school is worried about your ability to do well on that USMLE, right? Those board exams you'll have to take later on to get to, basically to get to the next step. So as you guys are looking at med schools and trying to figure out sort of your plan here, grab the med school admissions requirements book, that MSAR, to get an idea of the schools, the med schools that are in your range, right? Your GPA, you probably, unless you're a freshman now, you probably have a pretty good idea of your GPA. And so you want to see, if you haven't taken the MCAT, what sort of score you're really aiming for. And if you have taken the MCAT, where does your current score place you, and what work might you need to do to get to the schools you are particularly interested in? Let's take a look at some sample questions here, moving into the next part. So here we see our Chem Phys passage. Right now, when you're working these passages, we don't really want to stop and read the passages. If anything, you're going to skim them. Sometimes you don't even need to look at the passages at all. You can go straight to the questions. You might notice a figure for a passage, maybe a physics passage that has like a force diagram or something that you're able to see. Oh, this is just motion. I know this. I'm good at it. Then go straight to the questions. If we look at this passage here, some things we'd want to notice. I see, and you can use that highlighter tool, I see a few numbers. We see 99% of our U238, 1% U235. So those are numbers. We generally want to highlight those. Other things you would probably want to notice, we have heavier U238 in that second paragraph. We have lighter U235. So they do give us a direct comparison between these two uranium isotopes they've identified for us. And towards the bottom, they give us a wavelength of 502, like a wavelength range, I should really say, for one of them. So again, numbers we tend to want to pick up. But here you've kind of picked up the important things. And maybe this AVLIS thing because it's the name of something, right? If anything, if you're doing a little bit more skimming than that, you probably want to notice that the second paragraph did mention centrifugation. So we want to generally or pick up when they do certain processes. But when we get to our question here, question 4 says, with the Avlis method, how is the ultimate separation and collection of enriched uranium most likely achieved? Well, if we kind of consider this passage here from a little more general perspective, making what we call a passage map. So you see up here in the top right, I have paragraph 1. I can summarize that as basically there's uranium, or there's 2 uranium isotopes. And it says 1 for energy is hard to separate. Right? So if you did actually get that, kind of noticing, let's go back here, that second sentence is said only the latter is fissionable by thermal neutrons for energy production. Right? They've given us sort of an absolute or extremes, another thing you should generally look out for. So only one of them we can fission, or is fissionable by our thermal neutrons here. So you should kind of pick that up. Like we said, the second paragraph had something to do with centrifugation, and our third paragraph had this this Avlis laser, right? And that it can preferentially ionize our U-235, which is kind of just given to us in basically that first sentence of the paragraph. So kind of focusing on the first sentences of paragraphs, whether it's science or cars section, will be pretty useful for you understanding just the structure of what sort of information they've told you. So when we look at this, are the answer choices here. Remember, you always have 4 answer choices. And if you're focusing on process of elimination, it makes questions a whole lot more tackleable, right? Like considering here that we're talking about these, basically these analytical techniques, they don't separate compounds, right? When we're looking at centrifugation, we're looking at the separation with some Avlis laser. That's where answer choices C and D should kind of jump out, as there's, of course, after you've read them, will jump out as sort of a, this fundamentally cannot answer this question, right? We're going back to basics. Now you're down to a 50-50. Worst case scenario, you have a 1 in 2 chance of just guessing it right. But the thing is, you don't even have to know the correct answer. You can just spot a flaw, right? Answer choice A, the product of interest will be less dense. Well, Avlis is in the third paragraph, what our question's asking us about, right? The Avlis method. Density would only figure into centrifugation, which is our second paragraph. So this density thing, we're looking at, or basically looking at the wrong part of the passage with answer choice A. So it's got to be B, and you might not have been able to prove that with your quick skim of the passage, but we can disprove the other 3. So we want to focus on process of elimination, or POE. Like key to success on any standardized test is focus on process of elimination. All right, an example of a freestanding question here. We see an electromagnetic blood flow meter with an electric field strength of B equals 0.1 Tesla is used to determine that the speed of blood flow through an artery of diameter 1 centimeter is 0.2 meters per second. How much work is done in 1 second by the magnetic force on each sodium ion passing through this artery? Some of you might eliminate answer choice A right away, thinking like, well, that's crazy. It's got to be some amount of work. But something to keep in mind, notice how they've set up these answer choices, besides answer choice A, where they are kind of numbers or set up to be multiplied out, but they're not actually multiplied out. The MCAT does not give you a calculator. You do not have a calculator available to you, even though there are math-based questions. So you aren't really, or you don't need to be able to multiply these numbers out, and you won't need to take a minute to multiply them out to differentiate between answer choices. They've just kind of set it up here. But something to keep in mind, if you're utilizing that highlight tool that's available to you, oops. I don't know why that keeps happening here. All right. the highlight tool, which I'm just going to do some underlining, it asks how much work is done by the magnetic force, right? That's really what this question is asking. Sometimes you kind of got to cut through the crap on the test, whether it's in the question or in the passage, to figure out, well, what am I supposed to do here? And they ask how much work is done by the magnetic force. Oh, a little bit of content knowledge here, but the magnetic force is always perpendicular to the motion. And if the force is always perpendicular to the motion, it cannot do work, which means 0 joules actually is your correct answer. This is a pretty common actual physics type question where they'll ask about how much work is done by something, and it's likely 0 is the correct answer. Because then, might not be this exact question. They might ask about work done by the, centripetal force or work done by the normal force. Things that are always perpendicular. Like you can almost expect a question like this on your test, despite the fact that there's only 15 physics questions. Again, you can almost expect one like this. So content knowledge comes into play here, but even if it wasn't a question where the answer was simply 0, you wouldn't have to waste your time doing the math. It's just, can you quickly set it up? So you'd have to know which formula to use, and then which answer choice matches the actual formula. And pick it and move on. When it comes to cars, a lot of people struggle with cars because they spend too much time reading and not enough time working the questions and answers. But you might be thinking, I got to this passage, your heart might fall a little bit in this section because they're like, there's so much reading, I have to read everything, and it seems like I have to memorize so much right away. That means you're doing it wrong. Rather than reading the passage, trying to soak up as much information as you can, and then going to the questions, just go straight to the questions. If we come here to question, in this case 28, we already know what we're looking for. And in fact, this one tells us where to look. It says, in the 4th paragraph, Rousseau employs the metaphor of war to achieve which of the following. So we go to the 4th paragraph, and we look for the statement about war. He even makes war upon it. So we generally want to go up 3 lines, down 3 lines. And read in that little window to find our answer. You'll almost always find it in that window. And we're not going to take the time to read this passage here. But notice your answer choices, your options are comparison, contrast, contrast, contrast. If you actually read those 6 lines, you'd see it is in fact a comparison that's being made. Don't use stupid logic on the exam being like, well, 3 of the answer choices are contrast, so it's probably a contrast. No, words have very specific meanings, so make sure that it's in fact a contrast. Generally, in fact, metaphors are comparisons and not contrasts. So that clue is, or that's a little bit of a clue that comparison is a plausible answer, but metaphor doesn't exclude a contrast. So any of these are on the table, but if you read the passage, then it's pretty clear that A is your answer. Question 29 here, it says, as it is used in the passage, the term sovereign refers to, well, this is a vocab and context question. What does this in context refer to? If we come back to our last slide here and look in the passage, we see sovereign about 4 lines down into that last, or I guess second to last paragraph. And if you just pay attention to within, again, if you're reading a few lines up, a few lines down, you might notice they use the pronoun its. The sovereign, even its right in this matter. Well, just paying attention to that little detail. Compared to the answer choices, I have the state, superior judge, higher being, and a king. Well, a superior judge is usually a he or a she, a higher being is usually a he or a she, and a king is a he. So if we're talking about an it, we're looking at A as our answer choice. Don't need to get, all the way into the passage to really notice that that is the correct answer. There's a good and a bad to that. Once you notice that it's like, oh, even little details are super important in that, they called it an it, or, the difference between a singular and a plural word can mean the difference between the correct and incorrect answer, which means you just need to spot and eliminate obviously flawed answers. And an answer choice that says there were examples, when there was only one, you can stop reading that. If there was only one example, that answer choice is absolutely incorrect. So in this case, if we're referring to an it rather than a he or a she, then let's pick A and move on. The issue with that scares people is they think, well, what if I miss that little detail? Notice here we didn't have to read the entire passage to find that. We just had to know, like, skim and find the word sovereign. I kind of led you to that quickly, but then read in that general area and until you find a detail that can absolutely indicate, wrong answers, and then get down to one and move on. Question 30, we get an inference question. Based on the information in the passage, which one of the following opinions could most reasonably be ascribed to the author? A lot of times these sort of general inference questions or these opinion questions will be the first question you see on a passage. This should be a question you save to be like the last question on this passage, because you're not going to read the entire passage just to get this one point. But notice the last two questions, we could learn a little about the passage, find out something maybe about the author as we answered them. And once we're a little more familiar with this passage, then we could pick the correct answer probably a bit more quickly and even accurately than had we wasted all the time up front answering this question first. So I just want to hit here, save for last. When I say last, I don't mean like the last question in the section. I mean the last question on this passage before you move on to another passage. So, and in this case, Rousseau does not feel he's qualified to judge the actions of others. We didn't read the passage well enough to actually know this one. So not a big deal that we couldn't guess that one. For Psych Soc, a big point here, besides actually having that outside knowledge, right? CARS is the only section with no outside knowledge. Psychology, sociology, chem, phys, biochem, those sections all require outside knowledge. But another big thing when it comes to the Psych Soc section, you've got to be actually pretty good at just the scientific method, right? Fundamentals of sciencing well. And the other thing you need to be pretty good at for the Psych Soc section is because it is also pretty text heavy. Those CARS skills are going to translate quite a bit. So like here, notice we have a long passage and one little figure, but if we go to the question, it says the average individual diagnosed with IBS is a 40 to 50-year-old female who is white, educated, married, and middle to upper middle class. Based on this information, what might you conclude about IBS? We don't really need the passage for this question. And so although it is a passage-based question, you'll come across a number of these that are what we call memory questions that you don't need the passage for. They're basically freestanding questions. But your CARS skills will help you out here. Like this one, IBS is underdiagnosed in less affluent populations. That's possible, right? Is it something we would actually conclude? I don't know about that, but I'm not going to eliminate that answer. The IBS rarely affects younger men and women. Well, I can't actually say that like it's rare, right? And that's actually a bit of extreme wording that we always watch out for on the MCAT, where if they use absolute wording like always, never, only, or must, right? Those are like absolute languages. But also going beyond what the passage says, saying that something is rare or saying that something tends to happen, probably goes beyond what the author actually said. And the author, or in this case, the question doesn't tell us that something is rare in younger men and women. See, there's a causal relationship between education status and IBS. Even if there was a correlation, correlation does not indicate causation, so we can get rid of answer choice C. And then D, age, gender, race, and marital status should all be viewed as risk factors for developing IBS. Actually, this little should here is always should start to raise alerts on your as you read an answer choice. But there's nothing for us to conclude that we need to view these as risk factors. They are just some of the things that they did notice altogether as far as the average individual that is diagnosed happens to have all those, but that doesn't mean that they are risk factors individually, or that all of them are. So pick A, get your point, move on. Question 4, given the description of the study in this passage, which unknown factor might have the most influence on the validity of the results? This one is just, again, got to be pretty well versed in the scientific method, and pretty much always sample size is going to make any study like more valid. Increasing the sample size will make a sample or will make a study better, and a small sample size, kind of has a huge impact on whether anyone will take results seriously. So that is, again, don't really need the passage, although they say given the description of the study in this passage, your just understanding of good science can lead you to a quick answer here. 7, how might Sigmund Freud have treated an IBS sufferer? This is where you see the outside knowledge coming into play, right? And usually you can get rid of bad answer choices much more easily than good answer, or than looking just for good answer choices. And we have here physical, like helping the patient discover the physical cause. Now, Sigmund Freud was all about psychoanalysis. B, with a psychoanalytic approach, that sounds pretty good, right? And skim through the rest of the answer. There's nothing wrong with it, so you'd leave it there. C, in a group therapy session with sufferers of other psychological disorders. That, just from a scientific standpoint, is pretty bad science because you're introducing new variables. And it's not necessarily what Sigmund Freud was all about. And then D, Dr. Freud would be unlikely to treat an IBS sufferer, because he wouldn't consider it to have a psychological cause. That's sort of the equivalent of the answer cannot be determined, which is rarely the correct answer on the MCAT. But again, if you can get it just down to a 50-50 between, say, B and C, clearly the stronger answer for Freud is the psychoanalytic approach because he's the father of psychoanalysis. All right, getting into med school, like I said, the GPA and MCAT are one piece of the puzzle, but you do need to have great grades, great scores, and put it together in one great application. These are the foundations to you getting to your dream school. So as far as those great grades, if you find yourself ever stuck on a science concept, we do offer what we call homework help. We have thousands of students every night, like this is available around the clock, logging in, and you can be paired up with a tutor in under a minute to help answer questions you have from your homework or textbook or whatever it may be. So this is available. Highly recommend it if like we said, the average GPA for those med school matriculants is a 3.7. If you're struggling to maintain that, then get the help you need. Make sure that you are putting together, working towards the greatest application you can have. As far as great scores, I like to compare MCAT prep to getting in shape, right? Some people can get in shape just by buying that gym membership, right? They just need access to the resources and they can do it. That's like our self-paced course. Some people need a little more motivation or help, and that's where they take a class, right? You go to the cardio bar or take a spin class, whatever. That's like our ultimate courses or strategy courses. Our ultimate course includes a lot of content. That's like 123 hours of actual class time where we go over content and practice. We have our strategy courses, which expect you to know the content, and we're just going over the strategies to success. We also offer sort of boot camp style courses over winter break for those of you looking at the January test. To be honest, don't really recommend those unless it's the only thing that'll fit into your schedule. If you are that busy and it's the only way you can do it, go for it for those winter boot camps. Otherwise, most people find success spreading their prep over about 3 to 4 months, or taking their summertime, and we have our summer immersion courses where you basically do 6 weeks of 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. prep. That's only offered in 3 places around the world: San Diego, Texas, or I guess Austin, Texas, and Orlando. So if that is the sort of help and motivation you'll need and guide, then go for it. We also offer one-on-one tutoring. That's kind of like hiring that personal trainer. So find whatever option you'll need to help get you to achieve your goals and pick the best one. As far as the resources you get with a prep company like us, you'll have full-length practice tests. You need to monitor your progress. Whatever prep you do, you should be taking full-length tests periodically to get used to that 7.5-hour exam. We also offer Medflix, a number of movies, like 500 videos, I should say, we put together on the content and even some strategy to get better. So even if you do the prep on your own, you do have access to that. And that's all accessed through our industry-leading MCAT dashboard to help you keep all of your content and practice organized. One of the big things that is useful in there, the diagnostic tests we have. These kind of allow you to be a lazy prepper, in that it allows you to find what you're already doing well at, so you don't have to waste your efforts on that or those content areas. Spend your time on what you're weak on, or maybe polish some of your strengths a little bit, but don't spend a lot of time kind of relearning stuff you already know. It just is a waste of your time, and it won't actually help you improve your score. We have a tool called Amplifier, which has like almost 2,000 freestanding questions, blending learning and testing into one sort of experience. Some Nobel Prize winning research that showed basically you learn the information faster and you can recall it longer. So definitely an awesome tool, and it's available actually on your phone or on your smartphone, so that you can access these resources, on your way to class, or when you have little breaks here and there, so you can fit in your MCAT prep around your schedule. So as far as helping getting you into your dream med school, we do also offer admissions consulting. So our med school admission consulting, you'll have our counselor, Dr. Anita Pardue, or just Anita as she prefers to be called, has helped thousands of people get into medical school at this point. She's a doctor herself. So if you find that putting together that great application is very difficult for you, then get that leadership, get that counseling to help direct you, to maybe help you find the right schools to apply to, or what you need to focus on between now and the time that you apply. So you do have a lot of options there. We'll do a quick poll and then I'll get into any questions. So really quickly, let me pull the poll up. If you do want any more information, come on. Someone can follow up with you. So go ahead and basically submit your answers here, and then I'll start. My poll isn't quite working, but I'll answer any questions that Scott lets me know, because I can't see the questions, I don't think. But otherwise, so we've got about 65% voted, so all right, looks like we're pretty good there. So Scott, were there any questions that had popped in?
Yeah, first off, Scott, thank you so much for all that information. That was amazing. Very, very informational and right on point. So, yeah, there's a bunch of questions, and so I think probably given the time factor, let's stick to say 3 of them, and I'll kind of jump around. First question that came in basically says, I have an unbalanced 512 MCAT, the various scores. My advisor keeps telling me that I shouldn't retake, even though 123 is at the cutoff for section scores for many schools. What is your opinion?
All right, so I'm kind of on the same page as your advisor. There's no need to retake there. Schools are primarily judged on their overall score in terms of how they're ranked. They only care about that total score and the average total score. So there are a few schools out there, in particular the Canadian schools, that'll put a little heavier weight on the CARS score. So if that 123 is in CARS, that can bite you on, or at a few schools, but for the most part, the overwhelming majority of schools, it won't be a big influence. So that 512 is competitive, and if you have any schoolwork, maybe you have some, whatever section that is, if you have, A's in those types of classes that can demonstrate your abilities there, then you have absolutely nothing to worry about.
All right, perfect. Thank you for that. Question number 2, for someone taking the MCAT for the 3rd time, what suggestions do you recommend, and what questions should one be asking themselves for improvement?
So as far as recommendation, you absolutely must improve. When you test multiple times and your score doesn't go up, it reflects very poorly on you, in that schools start to wonder, are you just testing until you hope you get lucky and have a good score? Are you not putting in the effort that's necessary? So you do need to improve. As far as what you need to focus on, at this point, since you've done, I imagine, a good amount of prep and you know what sort of accuracy you're running at, like say you're running in a section, let's say cars, you're running at about 75% accuracy, like you're getting 75% of the questions right. You really need to start asking yourself, should I be doing this question as you're doing your prep? Because you need to find your areas of strength and weakness. Because honestly, for you to improve your score, you need to get maybe 80% of the questions right. So there's 20% of the test, or a fifth of the test you don't have to do. And the fifth of the test you don't do should be the hardest fifth of the test. So you need to start figuring out, should I even do this question? And you need to be able to determine that as soon as you get to a passage or a question, so that you're not wasting your time. You don't want to get halfway through a passage and be like, you know what, this is too hard, I'm just going to move on. Because now that is wasted time. And something to consider, that 20% of the, like in this example, that 20% of the test you don't do, remember that you do have a 25% chance of just blindly guessing the correct answer. So if you focused on 80% of the test, you made a few mistakes, but those were overcome by the few points you picked up from pure guessing, you will improve your score simply by doing less of the test. Focus on accuracy, and now that you have a benchmark and you know where you are, you know where or what you need to do for improvement. And then once you achieve that, if you get to 80% accuracy next time, maybe you can get 83% accuracy, right? And you just take it one step at a time, but it all comes down to the question of, should I be even doing this problem?
Awesome.
Which I get for many pre-meds is a difficult question. You're not used to that.
All right, Scott, so we'll use this one for the last question. So it says, is it true that you should stop reviewing once you are close to test day? How early before test day do you stop reviewing/studying?
So your final practice test that you take should be about a week, at closest 5 days to your official exam. And you're not doing any sort of content at that point. That last week should basically be polishing on your strategy, making sure your pacing is good. You're not going to really, or you shouldn't be trying to learn new content the week of the exam. At that point, you should be looking at, honestly, more peripheral things, such as making sure your sleep schedule is lined up so that when you wake up on test day, it's not a weird early morning for you. Making sure that your meal breaks are kind of lined up, and even if you can, line up your bathroom breaks throughout the day as best as you can to what you'll be experiencing on test day. But that should be a relieving stress sort of thing. If you consider it like marathon runners aren't running a marathon the week of the race. Like, they're actually, doing kind of the pre-race stuff where they are relaxing. They're doing just a little bit of, sort of jogging or running here and there, just like you. You'll be doing a few passages here and there. I would actually recommend maybe a couple passages, like first you do chem and phys passages, just like the test, take a little break. Then you do some cars passages, which is the second section. Then you do some bio and biochem passages, and with some psych-soc passages. But you're not trying to push yourself that last week.
Awesome. Scott, do you have time for a couple more, or do you want to answer some more?
I do, yeah. So,
okay, great. Okay, yeah. So, and we have quite a few people still logged on, so yeah, let's keep going. So the next question is, do they consider the science GPA or your entire undergrad GPA?
So they'll consider both. Science GPA is fairly important for, especially if you're in a science major in particular. They are looking for scientific sort of minds here, but they also need well-rounded applicants. So they're going to, there will be English majors and art history majors and such getting into medical school, because it lends something different to that applicant. But remember, those applicants, just like you, had to take those same prereqs, those physics classes, those bio classes and chemistry classes. So, that core is kind of what they're looking for, and they'll be able to judge them on this same metric of the MCAT to see can they perform on arduous, very long, primarily scientific exams. Because again, when it all comes down to it, they're worried about how will you perform on that USMLE at the end of school, and where will you be placed for your residency, because that's going to greatly influence their ranking as a school.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Next question. Is it better to have a higher GPA and lower MCAT, or vice versa?
The other way around. A good GPA and a bad MCAT score, again, calls into question your ability to perform on the USMLE and other board exams you'll take later. Versus, and again, the reason that's so important is that determines where you will go for your residency, or even if you become a doctor, honestly. But most people can pass. It's just where they will go for residency. And when people are doing, or when schools are lining up lots of, high scores and therefore getting good residencies, that means more money for their med school. That means higher ratings for their med school, and that is hugely important to them. So that low med score, or that low MCAT score can really almost at the more competitive medical schools, a low MCAT score can demolish your chances of entrance, versus a high MCAT score and a low GPA will be hard to overcome, but doable.
All right, perfect. So we're going to keep going here. Do introduction to science classes count for science GPA? For instance, intro to chemistry.
Yep, those do absolutely count. Those are basically the prereqs that they're making everyone do. So it's not just like upper division sciences that they're going to consider. And to be honest, as best as you can, you want all of your grades to be, sort of something you're proud of. So it's okay to have, a B or even a C in some of these classes, and kind of acknowledge that it's a weakness of yours. But ideally, you have a strength elsewhere in your grades and in your academic history that you can kind of lean into and say, yeah, chemistry is not my thing, but like they're not going to be worried about, say, intro chemistry, because chemistry is not, it's not like if you're bad at chemistry, then you'll never be able to make it as a doctor, right? How often are you using physics in the ER? It's not really there. They're just trying to see, just like you will have to throughout your medical career continue to take tests, even though you might specialize, right? You might become a heart surgeon. The tests you take will still include areas of medicine that are not your specialty. And they kind of need to see, can you still at least perform in those areas, even if it's not a strength of yours? So as far as your GPA, yes, these will, they'll count those, they'll look at them, but if you can, you can demonstrate that it won't be a problem by doing well in that section on the MCAT.
Perfect. Okay, so where do you get the MSAR?
That you can get from AAMC. Honestly, you can just find it online, just Google it, and it's pretty accessible. Also, pretty much any counselor you talk to, or go to your counseling department at your school if you're still in school, and they should have basically, either someone who's phenomenally well versed in it, or just have a bunch of resources there that are either printed copies of it or digital access to it.
All right, perfect. Let's see here. Okay, so when looking at the MSAR, should I use my undergraduate degree GPA or my master's degree GPA to determine target schools?
So those will be combined. Actually, a lot of people will use postbaccs and master's programs to help raise their GPA, which is why you do see so many people getting master's degrees or continuing education before applying to medical school. Or honestly, what's helped with that popularity is a lot of post-bac programs include MCAT prep, where you're kind of paying a lot of money. If it doesn't have a bachelor's degree a master's degree associated with it, you're probably paying a lot of money to help inflate your GPA and work on the MCAT. So you'll actually see that a lot. It's a little bit more recommended to go for an actual master's program or something that has a degree. And most importantly, complete that degree. Don't get into a master's program and then during your first year apply to medical school, because one, you haven't inflated your GPA as much as you hopefully can, or maybe even need to. And the other thing is, they don't really want to see you getting into a program and then leaving it for med school, because that is not only is that kind of cruel to the other program, but it also calls into question your loyalty, because if you get into their med school and then you find something better, right, that at least in your view better, what's to stop you from leaving and dropping out of their medical school when they could have given that seat to someone else? So they will combine those GPAs. If you've already completed it, awesome. Then you're hopefully in a pretty good position to put forth an application. As long as your undergrad GPA wasn't particularly bad and your master's GPA was only mediocre, like then you might still have some work to do to overcome that.
All right, Scott, you good for two more?
Sure.
Okay. So it says, I was wanting to get your opinion on taking just 1 year off after receiving my bachelor's, maybe volunteer work, intern related to healthcare med, before taking the MCAT and entering medical school. Yeah.
So first thing to kind of keep in mind when you apply to medical school, it's not like applying for college, right? Where you applied in the fall and you've heard back in the spring and then you were there the next fall. You are generally going through a whole year-long process, right? The applications open up in June and then you have secondaries and you start this entire process that can take you well into spring. Some people might hear back that summer. People with really absolutely strong applications might hear back that they've gotten in, and then they still have a year until med school begins. So the application process is pretty drawn out. But what I do want to say is if you are taking a gap year or planning on a gap year before you submit that application even, which means you're basically taking 2 years until med school begins, you do need to be clearly working on something. If you just took a year off to be like, yeah, I hung out in the Bahamas and was enjoying life before med school, it's not necessarily indicating to these admissions committees that you're a go-getter and that you're motivated. But if you are, volunteering, you are shadowing doctors, you are maybe taking or continuing to work on your MCAT or doing something that is furthering your application into medical school, then it's absolutely a great idea, and it's a really common thing. Many people are taking gap years post college before applying, whether it is to do working in a completely different field or to improve their application. It is a common thing. You're actually not some sort of weird outlier to take a gap year.
Okay. All right. So this is kind of a two-parter, and I'll just ask them together. I've taken most classes besides main prerequisites, orgo, physics, chem 1 and 2, at a community college due to being in the military for 5 years. I still have my last 2 years to finish. Will having 2 years of college from a community college affect my chances of being accepted? And then also, this is part two, will having a military background in medicine help my application?
All right. Well, within the military, you do have some options available to you outside of the traditional med school application route, so you might look into those. As far as affecting your chances, excuse me, of having the community college behind you, the GPA, it will come down to your GPA and scores again, so you can, although it's in one sense not as competitive as many large universities, if you are doing well in class, getting primarily A's, and then you can perform well on the MCAT, that the great equalizer is the MCAT. Because if you were taking easy classes at an easy school, then you get to the MCAT and you don't do well. Like, even though you might have had A's and you have a really strong GPA, if you really suck on the MCAT, then they can tell that that's what's going to hurt you. So it's not that why that MCAT is, or why a bad MCAT score really hurts you is because it starts to call into question a strong GPA, because it might be reasons such as simply attendance and bonus questions or bonus projects or extra credit that got you your grades, and not your actual academic strength. So not a huge issue that it is from a community college, as long as you still are on track to complete a degree and are completing all the prereqs and then perform well on the MCAT, then you shouldn't see any struggle or any big issue there. And you actually will have, having been in the military, you will have something additional on your application that many people are missing. So there's good and bad to it. But if you put in the effort and do well on your MCAT and kind of prove that, despite being, as many people view just community college, you can kind of say, hey, the rigor has been there. I've been putting in the effort, and I belong in med school as much as the next person at the more competitive school.
Awesome. Okay. Scott, first off, thank you so much for staying the extra time and answering the questions. There are more questions that we're not going to get to tonight. But please do know, everyone, that someone will be reaching out to you to answer those questions for you, and to make sure that you get the answers that you need. As a reminder, there's been a couple questions in here. How do you get the recording? That recording will be sent to you in an email. So you will be getting the recording in the next day. If you'd like to check out some other upcoming webinars that we have, very simple process. Go to princetonreview.com/webinars. And also feel free to pass that link along to any friends or classmates that you think it could be very useful for. Once again, just want to thank Scott for all of your amazing information. That was really well done. And thank all of you for attending and joining us tonight. So have a great night, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one. All right. Bye, everyone.